So, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pete Burden, and I'm your host today on the Healthy Power Alliance podcast. We're using this space to explore what it means to be powerful together, to look at how human power, particularly as it appears in organizations and in communities, can benefit other humans and the planet we depend upon. We're speaking with people who are in the middle of doing it, people who think they know how to do it, and people who are doing in-depth academic studies of what really works and probably what doesn't work as well. We love theory, but we're mostly interested in practice. So with that said, let me get into the depths with our current guest. We're very lucky to have Simon Fanshawe with us today. I've known Simon for many years. I'm just going to give a few words about you, Simon, and you can probably kind of fill out on anything I miss. But I know you're the author of several books. You're a really experienced chair and non-executive director of many boards. Way back in the past, or I don't know how long ago it was, you were one of the co-founders of Stonewall. And I think I'm not quite sure of the timing, but I know you've been a kind of entertainer to some extent. You've been on TV, all of those kind of things. But what you're doing now, as I understand it, you're working as a practitioner in the field of diversity and inclusion. And I think you've been doing for that a long time. Have I missed anything kind of critical in there?
Well, I make good mayonnaise.
That's very important. I've just been making some flapjack and really messed it up. So I appreciate that.
Now, I would say I'm a good cook, but no, that's very kind of you to cover the incoherence that people laughingly call my career.
It sounds to me like you've had a very successful career. So tell me a little bit more about the work you're currently doing, if you don't mind. I mean, what's your current role?
Well, we have this business called Diversity by Design, and it's called that for good reason, because an awful lot of the work on diversity is, I guess, performative, really. I mean, I wrote a piece recently for the Sun-Times Business section last weekend, and I said that, people who get involved in diversity have a terrible habit of grabbing the diversity trolley and shooting off down the diversity aisle, and chucking in the lanyards and the religious calendar and the changeable website logos and the campaign days and this and that and the other. And, all of this stuff becomes a set of activities and often a pro forma set of activities. But the question really for me is whether it changes anything. And if it is true that there are two aspects to diversity, which I would argue, I call them the diversity deficits and the diversity dividends. And if that is true, then diversity really has a core purpose, which is relatively simply stated. One is to make sure that we remove barriers to people's talent, whether that's as groups or as individuals. And the second thing is that once we do that, that we combine people in such a way that they can contribute and collaborate together at their best. And that's what it's about. That's why we talk about it. We talk about it because fundamentally because humans can't understand each other. And so we need to kind of, spend some time trying to work out how to understand each other in the constant knowledge that we won't. So those are the basic tasks. And I think diversity gets diverted from that. So what we've always tried to do is to develop ways of approaching this that makes diversity really an approach to talent to drive business or organizational goals. That's the fundamental difference, I think. So we spend a lot of time with organizations saying, why do you want to do this? I'll give you a very good example. A long time ago, we were asked to help add diversity through recruitment to the staff of an English literature department in one of the big universities. And I said to the person around the department, why are you trying to do this? You're going gangbusters. It's all going fantastic. You've got great students, you've got great research, you've got great entry tariffs, you've got great degree attainment. It's all marvelous. And she said, well, it's very simply stated. She said, there's great literature being written in English by people who are not English. I want to add that to my teaching staff so I can represent it in the teaching and the research. Here's the thing. It would look like ethnic diversity. That's not what she wanted. She wanted cultural and geographic diversity. And it's being that specific that means that you can really add value, in her case, to the core objectives of the department, which is teaching and research.
All right, lovely. Thank you. That's a very full answer. You and I, just before the call...
It's a polite way of saying I went on a bit. So, no, thank you.
I can see this is going to be fun. Yeah, I'm just not a good interviewer, Simon. So you have to forgive me in that way. I'm just going to kind of just say what comes out of my head.
Very
I'm not
good.
terribly practiced in doing this. Um, but before the call, we were talking about healthy power, and I was saying to you that the way we're defining power is as this thing of getting goals met or getting needs met, and that healthy power is this process where you're doing that in a way where you have the same effect on other people. So rather than doing that in a toxic way, which takes other people's power away, you're doing it in a way that builds everybody's kind of power and their ability to continue meeting their goals. So I wonder, can you fit that into what you've just described? Can you say, I mean, do the two things fit together in some sense at the higher level, perhaps?
Yeah, I think they do. I think that the way to explain that is, in a sense, the mistake that some people make about inclusion. And what they do is there's a sense in which inclusion is kind of is made up of being nice to people or being kind to people, or it's a form of democracy, if you like. And actually, it isn't. I mean, the thing about leadership is that the fundamental quality, it seems to me, about leadership is that leaders need to take responsibility for the fact that they have to take decisions. And there are a couple of ways you do that. You either say, really clearly, everybody, I'm going to have to make this decision. And I am interested now in your evidence, your views about what that decision might be, but I'm really clear about I'm having to take it. So I'm going to engage you intellectually, technically, in whatever way you want to contribute. Or the other thing is to say, and I always use the example in this one, is parking. This might seem a bit off-beam, but stick with me. If you're a council, never go to a group of residents and say, would you like a parking scheme? Because they will say no, at which point you're snookered. What you do is you say to them, you're having a parking scheme, would you like to design it? Now, those of you who know Brighton, who are listening, I don't know whether this is international or national, but Brighton has a number of terraces on the seafront, and I happen to live in one of them. And many, many years ago, the council came along and said, would you like a parking scheme? And everybody except me, who doesn't have a car, by the way, said no. So there was a huge argument, and eventually everybody agreed, okay, we're having a parking scheme. The council imposed it, which didn't do the council any good, by the way, because everyone was now really annoyed with the council. But what they did was they decided to put, originally, the parking was designed so you had cars down both sides of the street. It's a very beautiful terrace. It's a wide terrace as well. And so what people did was they said, why don't we put the cars in a herringbone down the other side so that you can see the sweep of the terrace, and those people who live in basements won't have exhaust pouring into their things and they'll have more light. Now, that's a classically good way of making a decision. This is what we're doing. This is what and I want you now to design it. So I think there are those two things. And to me, they help you think about inclusion, because what inclusion is not is giving certain groups of people a veto. Mm-hmm. And it's also not about democracy. It's about how you engage people at their best, but within the context of the common goal of an organization. I'm talking about organizations and businesses, because the thing about businesses is that you don't have anything in common except what the business is trying to achieve or the organization is trying to achieve. You're strangers. You don't know people before you go to work. You might become friends with them, you might marry them, but you don't know that before. You're just a bunch of strangers slung in a room and somebody says, make pizzas or whatever. So I think it directly relates to this notion of inclusion. And the mistake is when people think, oh, this is all about being kind, which ends up with them being popular. It's what I call chum management. I remember asking somebody you and I both know well, who I won't mention, but I remember asking him once when he became chief executive of a company, what's the difference? He said, oh, I can't go to the pub anymore.
Blew that opportunity. Yeah. All right. Lovely. So this is a perfect bit of context setting for what we want to do, what I'd like to do. But I want to dive into power now, because again, as I said, the reason I really wanted to interview you is because you have all this experience of putting this into practice. You've had, I don't know, millions of conversations with people over the years where you've been trying to do this kind of work. So I'd like to start by exploring power. And when did you first kind of experience power yourself, and how did you experience power?
Interesting question. I suppose as students, That was the first time I encountered what you might call organizational power. There we were in the student union, and what should we do? And I remember there was a lovely trot. Those of you who are old enough like me will remember the SWP, or before that, the IS. But the thing about trots is they have a very particular method of operating, which was known as the transitional demand. And I remember saying once, the student union was deciding, the trots were arguing that we should, there should be a cap on rents, we should not have prelim examinations, and Britain should withdraw from NATO. And I remember saying to Frank, that's ridiculous. Why are we, I don't know whether it was NATO or not, but what a ridiculous demand.
Yeah.
The university can't do anything about that. And Frank said, exactly. Because what that's all about is it's all about a form of demand that proves that you're powerless. And therefore, your consciousness is raised because it shows you how ghastly the establishment of the elite are. And I remember realizing at the time that the person who was the student union president, a splendid person called Lindsay Thomas, who has spent much of his adult life chasing white-collar crime in the city, he was a brilliantly pragmatic politician. And the thing that I learned from Lindsay was that what mattered was the outcome, was the result. Mm-hmm. So, and what Lindsay was really brilliant at, I think, was he was a principled pragmatist. So if you argued for a rent cap, we may not have got the rent cap at the level we wanted, but we got a rent cap which actually helped people with their cost of living.
Mm.
So that was a very powerful influence on me because, and I can give you another great example, I think, in the Stonewall era. And by the way, I was not in any way centrally involved with Stonewall at this point, but I was watching it and knew the people who came up with a particular compromise. But the really interesting thing was civil partnerships as versus equal marriage. So when civil partnerships were invented, which was about 10 years before equal marriage, so we're talking 2004. So what did we want to achieve? What did Stonewall want to achieve? Well, what it wanted to achieve was the fact that if you were in hospital and you were gay, your partner could not get access to your medical information because they were not the next of kin. Mm-hmm. If you died intestate, the parents could come and take your house away from your partner with whom you'd lived for 40 years in that house. And these are examples that were live at the time. So what we needed was a legal construction that would give us those rights. We also knew that if we took marriage to Parliament, it would only ever be a private member's bill, and therefore, because it wasn't in a manifesto, it would therefore be it would be defeated in the House of Lords, primarily by the bishops, because the religions think they own marriage, but also by other people. So there's no point arguing for marriage, because we wouldn't have won it. So somebody came up with civil partnerships. Somehow everybody thought that was all fine, because they didn't feel like it affected marriage, or it didn't, marriage between a man and a woman, but you've got this other thing. But there were gay activists who called this marriage apartheid. And I used to say to them, hang on, number one, it delivers what we want, which means that when you're in hospital, your bloody partner can get access to your doctor. But the other thing is, everybody will call them weddings. I'll tell you what, you'll go to these civil partnerships and there will be kids skidding across the floor on their knees. Granny will be dancing with the 12-year-old. It'll look exactly like a wedding between a man and a woman. It just won't be. And I tell you what, that will eventually usher in equal marriage. Mm-hmm. For 10 years. That's a classic example, I think, of the way in which the outcome is separate from how you deliver it. So, that notion of, as you say, power, you're achieving your objectives and you're meeting people's needs. Not everybody's needs. Some people said this is an inequality and it's symbolic of an inequality. Mm-hmm. Hence marriage apartheid. So I think I've learned very pragmatic lessons from people much cleverer than me about how you achieve objectives. And when I'm at my worst, by the way, what I want is total agreement and I want victory. And that is the moment at which you realize that's not good for you, because it gives you a kind of spiritual eczema.
I mean, and perhaps that's something that everybody experiences. We all have times when we want total victory, as you say, but to notice it is really useful. And again, what I'm getting, I think it's really, putting it across really clearly that taking a pragmatic approach and being focused on the outputs and the goals. And then I'm curious about the tactics again. So, you know, you're in that setting, you're trying to get something to happen, you've got clearer about your goals, and then what's going to happen is you're going to talk to people, I assume.
Yeah.
You know, when you were talking about that, you mentioned several conversations you'd had with other people to try and. So, what do you do, Simon? What's in your repertoire as a person working in this space? How do you deal with people who maybe have more formal power than you, for example, or maybe they don't, but they have more, I don't know, intellectual power, or they might have more knowledge or power in some other form. How do you deal with that, or how have you dealt with it?
Well, the thing that I talk to exec teams and others about now is I always talk about the idea of the bigger principle. Again, going back to Stonewall, what was interesting was that Stonewall was started in 1989. And people who are old enough like me will remember the Section 28 thing, which was an attempt. It was really using lesbians and gays to beat up what in those days, I remember the tabloids used to call the loony left authorities. So it wasn't really about us, I think. It was sort of about us, but it wasn't really about us. It was really using people's disgust in some cases or disapproval of us, you know, to beat up the local authorities. And that's the key. Because the response that we made to that was really important, because we didn't say when we went out campaigning, we want you to approve of us, we want you to affirm us, we want you to think that we're morally sound. Because if we'd done so, we would have walked up and down the streets of even Brighton and we were 80-20 down, you know? Mm-hmm. But what you can do in that situation is you can say to people, do you think it is right that a group of people should be discriminated against as a group? And there are quite a lot of people who don't approve of homosexuality, who nonetheless also don't approve of being discriminated against as a group, because that's happened to them, i.e. Catholics, i.e. Jews. You know, they know what that means. And I'm not saying all Catholics and Jews are anti-homosexual, they're not. But there are elements of all religions who are profoundly, you know, disapproving of homosexuality. So what you can do is you build these broad alliances around what I call the bigger principle. So you're always appealing to something that can unite people. So back to my organizational point, what you're doing is you're saying to people, right, you know, we've got a big pivot now. We're going to have to do this big thing. So I remember years ago being asked in to work with a group of people in Lloyd's Bank. And we were up at Roffey Park, the business place up near Crawley. And it was all about what I was doing really was talking to them about, and I gave them examples from the community actually. So there were things like, there were scenarios, there's things like they're going to put a bail house in your street, or there's a homeless shelter in your street, you know. And it was about how do you deal with this in the community when you've got very different opinions about this. So it's exactly about this. How do you find that bigger principle? And there was a wonderful example. Sorry, it's slightly off the point, but it's such a beautiful story. There was a boy who had Down syndrome, and who was the son of one of the families that lived in a particular street that one of these people came from. And originally there had been a bit of difficulty because he had this habit of just wandering off. So he'd appear all over the shop, and people kind of first their reaction was to, you know, get antsy about that. They found that a bit, you know, untoward or difficult. And then everybody just started taking care of him. And so what the parents realized was it didn't matter which house he went into, somebody would look after him and they'd bring him back, you know? Mm-hmm. And so they sort of turned it round, because actually they realized that what was better was their sign that they were looking after each other. That became something to appeal to. Anyway, the point of the story is this, is that I was working with this bunch of people from Lloyd's, a significant number of whom in this IT and massive technological transformation that Lloyd's was going through would not be working for Lloyd's after the transformation was done. And yet they stuck with this project. And the reason they stuck with the project, I think, was that the leaders of the project appealed to their professional sense of integrity and pride. Mm-hmm. And they offered them support were they to be made redundant or whatever. So there was ample of that. And, you know, it was the big bangs going on, so there was potential for all of that. And I was really struck by the fact that the bigger principle there was doing a good job. I may lose mine, but actually what really matters to me is I'll do a good job and that'll give me a good reference and I will be able to go and work somewhere else. So I think those are the things that constantly strike me, I think, is when leaders manage to take difficult decisions, but they engage people and they do it not by telling people what to do, but by saying, this is a difficult decision that I'm going to have to take. And I want to engage you in the best way of doing it.
Great, great. Let me just check that I've kind of understood that. So part of your practice at the moment, or in the last few years as well, has been kind of encouraging leaders to look at this, the bigger principle, you called it?
Yeah, I call
which
it.
I'm understanding as a kind of framing of the situation. Yeah. And that framing sometimes could be a visionary statement or something, but it could also be a value statement, like relating to my professionalism as an individual.
Yes.
So something like that. And then you're encouraging people to do that. And within that context, then, even changes that are quite difficult for individuals kind of make sense to people. Is that right?
And if you look at the opposite, which is the way an awful lot of politics is practiced these days, is that instead of seeing how we can build those bigger principles around, I mean, if you take some of the really, really difficult ones at the moment, the sort of sex and gender debates, for me, it's not about whether you're pro-trans or you're anti-gay or you're anti-trans or pro-gay or you're Christian. It's not about that at all. It's about how do we offer and support young adults, children and young adults, in such a way that they can make decisions that are the best decisions for the rest of their life. That's the bigger principle. I'm not interested in the ideology of it. I'm interested in how those young people and those young adults grow into lives that they want to lead for the rest of them. So that's what I mean by the bigger principle. Whereas if you look at what actually happens in a lot of politics now, is there is a demand for an ideological agreement. So you find, for instance, around, I mean, abortion's not a big issue in this country in the way it is in America. But it is interesting that those people who, I mean, there's a broad consensus in this country, and it engages a very broad range of views of a whole bunch of other stuff. One of the things I'd be really interested in is I'd be really interested to know whether people who think that a woman has a right to choose and therefore think abortion ought to be available in the way that it is in Britain. I wonder whether many of them have a different view around assisted suicide or whatever you want to call it. I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't ask people to agree to both. If I was trying to open up, a woman's right to choose. And that was one of the things that was really interesting about Stonewall, was that we never really asked people to approve of us. I mean, we sort of did. We said we want equality, but we never said what we're asking you to do is to approve of us. We said what we're asking us to do is give us equal rights as citizens.
So again, a high level, bigger principle, really, as a way of doing it. Okay, so this is fascinating and incredibly useful. Thank you. I'm already struck, and I've known this about you already, however, what a skilled speaker you are and what a great intellectual you are. And also, you started out right at the beginning of this conversation by making a joke when I was talking to you. So you use humor a lot, for example. And so I suppose what I'm interested in, as well as talking to people about the bigger context, which I'm sure you can do, what other practices do you use? I mean, storytelling, giving examples, making jokes, etc., etc.
Well, absolutely making jokes. I mean, I've done a series of speaking engagements as it happens over the last few weeks, and I've begun every single one of them because they've all been, not all of them, but they've been tech companies. You've gone into rooms where there's 80 people, 60 people or whatever. And kind of somebody somewhere's decided, that they're going to do this thing on diversity. And I've done the same thing every time. I start off and say, look, just let me start by saying I'm really sorry about this. I said, you could be doing something much more useful, but actually what you're doing is you're going to have to sit in a room for an hour and a half and listen to some gay tell you what you can and can't say. And inevitably people laugh. And the reason they laugh is that that's not what they expect from the diversity session. I'm doing it because A, I want to give them permission to laugh, but B, I want to open up what can be an immensely toe-faced discussion, which is mainly involved with what I call point and punish.
Right.
The first thing you need to do before you get anywhere talking about the stuff of it, you need to give them the relaxation that actually this is fine. We can relax about this. No eggshells here.
Okay.
So that's one thing. The other thing that I always say to people is, I said, the thing about diversity is that it is precisely about human difference, and everybody's got a voice. I will not get involved in a discussion of diversity which enables somebody to say, well, oh, the heterosexual white men. Well, no, hang on. You can't talk about diversity and then dismiss a whole group of people. What I will say is that if you're a bloke and a woman says to you, if you're walking home and you see a woman in front of you walking home on her own at night, cross the road and walk round her because she feels safer. Now, you don't have to be a woman, but you do have to listen differently to a woman if you're a man. It's useful to listen differently to somebody who's black if you're white, because they will have different experiences. They won't have a homogenous experience, by the way. That's a separate question. But so you need to listen differently to each other. And in order to understand each other, which you won't do, as I said before, but the listening differently is really important. But actually, everybody's got a voice in this because it's about diversity.
Yeah.
So I think that's another thing that's important. So when you're talking about the practical things that you say to people, if you turn up to a group and tell them we're going to talk about diversity and immediately sound like you're dismissing a whole bunch of them, well, you're not going to get them engaged in the topic. And I know that sounds very obvious, but it's actually quite peculiar how people do it. The second point I would make is about storytelling. One of the things I do at the beginning, I did it the other day, and it was very funny. The person who organized the thing said, I don't know. I don't think they'll do that. And what that was, is I say to people, find someone next door to you in pairs, and I want you to find 3 things between you that are completely different, that matter. Your family, your upbringing, your parents divorced? Did they stay together? Do you move around? Did you cross continents? Are you religious? Are you not religious? Something that's really important in that. And this person says, oh God, I don't know that, they're pretty straight blokes, I don't think they'll do all that. I tell you, I said that, I barely got to the end of the sentence. The noise in the room was extraordinary. Because it's really interesting. And it's quite counterintuitive too. Somebody said this to me yesterday when I was doing a session. They said it's really counterintuitive to be asked to find differences. Because what you tend to do is try and find things that are similar. And I always make a slight joke of it. And I say, well, people go to parties and they meet someone and they say, oh, I met this person. Oh, so much in common. And I always say, how dull. Because the interesting stuff is the stuff you don't have in common. It's the stuff you don't know. That's what I'm interested in. And of course, we need the stuff that we have in common. We need that. But actually, we need it as alongside the recognition that really the stuff is where we have difference. So I think there are some things you can do, which is not every. And the thing I would emphasize is, I tend to, people say, oh, you're still funny now. You're not a comedian. I go, no, I became a comedian because I was funny. The other way around. So, humor is a way I like to communicate, but that's just my way. There are lots of people who've got lots of different ways of doing it. So it's not be funny. It's think about what will relax people into the subject and genuinely enable them to contribute in a relaxed way so they don't feel that they're going to be punished for saying something. I try not to use the words good and bad and right and wrong, talking about behavior and language. I try to use the word helpful and unhelpful.
Yes. Okay. Very nice. And having just said good myself. But so what you're doing there is you're opening people up, as you say, and encouraging them to notice and talk about the differences. And in your case, you can do that through humor and storytelling and all of those kind of things. Do you have, what's that doing to power then between people? Say you're in that one of those speaking. Where's the power is on the podium, isn't it? There are people on the podium who've got power, or is it that
one of the things that's
Oh.
difficult, I think, is that there is too much at the moment around this idea that white people have power over black people and men have power over women, and that straight people have power over gay people, and so it goes on. And the point about that is that, I mean, I often say the thing about discrimination is it may be an everyday event, but it's no longer an all-day event. In other words, you'll know, anybody who's in a relationship will know that power ebbs and flows. Yes, there are material circumstances of groups of people. I mean, there was a time when women literally didn't have the power to own property or whatever. And yes, of course, patriarchy is a way of trying to understand what you might call the structural power between men and women. But that doesn't mean in every single relationship the man always has the power and the woman has none. What it means is it's a framework within which power ebbs and flows between people. And I think it's rather dangerous to think about diversity only in terms of group disadvantage or group power, because it distorts people's experience. It may define an element of it or describe an element of it. It may give you a framework, but it doesn't define them. So I'm not, it always annoys me when I see, I know I shouldn't be annoyed really because I know what they're doing. But you see the rainbow flag outside, a kitchen utensil shop, and you think, that's are they selling? Am I going in there as a gay man? Are they selling gay pots and pans? What's gay about? Now I know what they're doing. They're signalling actually, we're all on board and it's all lovely and do come in and you won't be shouted at. I'm not entirely sure it's helpful any longer. I think we've got beyond that point. But my point is, at what point are you gay and at what point are you not gay? And I have a friend, a black friend, which is significant to the story, which is why I describe her thus, who's a judge. And I once asked her about her day. And it's interesting because when she wakes up in the morning, she's who she is as an individual. She wakes up with her husband and blah, blah, blah. She goes out in the streets. She's another black woman on the streets of South London. When she gets to court, she's your honour. She's in the family court. She take your kids away on evidence. She's God. When she does that, she has been very roundly and racistly abused by people, but they don't have power. They have nastiness, but she's just, taking. Then she gets back on the tube again. She's another woman on the streets of South London. It's a really interesting way, I think, the thing to remember is that who we are ebbs and flows.
Okay.
So the fact that she will suffer from a racist insult or potentially violence because she's black, that doesn't also mean that she's not. That doesn't mean she's not also a judge.
Yeah. Yes.
And those two things do sit side by side. And I think this idea of white fragility or whiteness or blackness, I'm not frankly sure that it helps us understand each other. I'm not sure it describes what is really the relationship between us, except in certain circumstances.
Okay. It's particular to certain circumstances. And you're also saying something about the importance of context. So in some situations, it really matters.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're also arguing for awareness about the context in which we're sitting. It's a bit like when you're talking about the framing earlier. The framing and the context make a really big difference. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think that, I say whenever I'm presenting and working with groups, I always say, look, the data will tell you that there's group disadvantage. You have to understand how that operates, actually, because otherwise you won't solve it. But that doesn't mean to say that you don't also have to hold in your head individual talent and ambition. And you got both. And what you can't do, and that's the worst, is that great phrase, the tyranny of low expectations. The worst thing you can do to somebody is to say, well, you're gay, you'll never get anywhere. Stonewall's got this thing at the moment where they keep on putting out a petition saying, dear Prime Minister, we want to be able to walk down the street holding hands. Gay hate crime is rising. And actually, this is BS. Gay hate crime is not rising in the UK. It is infinitesimally lower than it ever was. And in most places in Britain, gay couples are pretty safe on the street. That's not to say there isn't homophobic violence. Because intolerant people do get more intolerant faced with tolerance. It pushes them into a corner and they do react. So of course there's homophobic violence, but it's sheer scaremongering to trap people in the idea that their sexual orientation makes them a victim.
Okay. I'm a little bit aware of the time, but I want to ask you one more question and then give you a chance to kind of just bring in anything else you want to bring in. But the question was really, I know you've been involved in politics throughout your life, both local politics in Brighton and other forms of politics. Is there something different about politics? Because you've been talking a lot about diversity and inclusion and how power operates in a political situation. You know, so you're trying to do something in local government or whatever it is. How do you go about that?
I think one of the really interesting, if you think of the progress of somebody who wants to be an MP, what they have to do to start with is they have to win their party's nomination. And you often find, I mean, you've got it with the American elections at the moment. People say, oh, Kamala Harris, you know, said this, that, and the other in the primaries, whenever it was. And I've got no particular, I'm not waving a flag for Kamala Harris. I'm just using her as an example. Well, one of the difficulties is that you get put in that position where you have to appeal to the people who are going to vote. And the trouble is the people who are going to vote are by and large quite a minority crowd. So you've got this difficult position where you sort of have to say things to them in order to get onto the platform in the first place. You know, you don't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. So you have to get there. The next thing you have to do, so then you're selected as the candidate. So now you're the Labour, Conservative, whatever it is, candidate for little Sprogton on the Marsh. Now what you have to do is you have to stand for election. Well, in standing for election, you're now standing on a national manifesto. So you're standing on, so again, you're having to make compromises what you might or might not believe. So if you take it in a local, well, not even a local context, there are now a series of Labour MPs who have been elected in places. We've got them down here where we both live, in Shoreham and Worthing. You've been elected on a manifesto that is talking about we're going to have the grey belt as well as the green belt. We're going to build on the green belt. We're possibly going to build on the green belt. We're definitely going to build on the grey belt. In other words, we're going through a massive house building program. We're going to build 1.5 million houses in 5 years. They won't, by the way, but that's what the manifesto said. If you're in an area like Shoreham or Worthing, and there are loads across the country now, actually you're going to face a lot of local opposition to that. So you stood on the manifesto and you had to stand on the 1.5 million. But that's going to be a very difficult. Now you're voted for by those people. Now they're going to say, hang on a second. Yeah, but you said, you know, you're our local MP now. We want you to do blah, blah, blah. Equally, there's another group of people who are saying, we want jobs, we want prosperity, we want growth. And there's another bunch of people saying, we don't want house building. Well, those are connected. And then as an MP, you have to make a decision which you think represents the best interest of the whole constituency, because now you're no longer Labour only, you're the Labour MP for the whole constituency. So what I'm saying really is that one of the things that's, I think, really difficult for politicians is that we constantly put out tripwires for them, and we don't accept what is the inevitable constraints of that representative function. So, you know, I feel really sorry for MPs. I think it's an amazing system. There's two or three that I know who are astonishing. There's one, I remember Chris Smith, who was the MP for Islington and Finsbury. He had Cypriots and Turks communities in his constituency, and Greeks as well, I think. And I used to do a fundraising dinner for him, and they all used to come. And I used to think, that's amazing. And he did it by not promising them different things. He did it by explaining the reality of the position and then working through it. Right. And so I think that's, and one of the problems with politics at the moment is that it has become so divided and so divisive that actually, you know, when people change their mind or take a different position, immediately it's a U-turn. Well, yeah, okay, but who was it who said that thing about when the evidence changes, my opinion does, you know? I can't remember who it was, but somebody very wise. And Dag Hammarskjöld, I think the UN man, didn't he say, I reserve the right to be wiser today than I was yesterday? You know, and actually that, I think there's a real problem at the moment. We've lost a lot of that. And it's the demand for total agreement. And I go back to, it's not finding the bigger principle. It's just demanding that people do what you want.
Yeah, I hear that connection. I want to ask one more thing. So, because what I'm hearing is that, you know, and it's particularly bad for politicians because they're incredibly constrained. to some extent, we're all constrained in our lives, aren't we? There are things going on. How have you personally managed to maintain your individualistic position as Simon Fanshawe within the various constraints that you've lived in as well? Do you understand
I
how
think
you do that?
well, one of the things I think people ask when they get older is they say, have I changed or have they changed? In other words, are my values and my politics the same as they were, broadly speaking, or have I actually become, a terrible right-wing fart? Now, on the one hand, I will admit that I was bicycling down the street during the summer and I saw some child with pink hair and a nose ring. And I thought, well, he'll never get a job. And then I realized I'd become my father. You have to be so you do have to be a bit careful about that. And I found a quote from my book, which is all about, well, the trouble with young people these days, blah, and blah, and blah, and blah. And of course, it turns out to be Sophocles in the 5th century. That's been going on forever. I think there are some basic principles which I've tried to explain, which I've really learned, which I've tried to apply. I would say the biggest single influence on me in the last 10 years was getting married. I mean, I've married a Nigerian Muslim. So the two of us working out what that means. Plus, I'm a huge extrovert and I'm very social. And I've also married an introvert whose idea of hell is a room full of people he doesn't know. Whereas I'm really interested in that,
Yeah.
etc. So what have I learned from that? What I've learned is my friend Julia has this great thing. She says there's an argument in every relationship that you will always have. And you've got to decide whether to have it, avoid it, or manage it. And you do that because your bigger principle is keeping the relationship together until the point at which that balance changes and you don't want the relationship anymore. But as long as you do, that's what you do. And everybody who's in a relationship knows that. I mean, you know that, Adam might want to go and see Transformers 2, and I might want to go and see Paddington 3. Well, actually, he likes Paddington, but I might want to go and see Hugh Grant in whatever she's called, the Renée Zellweger films. What's she called? Bridget Jones. I don't want to see Transformers. He doesn't want to see Bridget Jones. But if we both want to spend Saturday night together, actually, we'll probably compromise.
Same thing, bigger principle.
I guess, but it's really come home to me being married, which I really like, much to my surprise, because I used to think being married was just total defeat. And I think I've really learned something because he's very patient with me, probably, and maybe I'm quite nice to him as well. But so I think that I don't think my politics have changed. I think what I've tried to do is I've tried always to say, when I say what I think should happen, I do have a sense that I'm always interested in the debate about whether that's the right thing. It's really dangerous to think you're always right. Now, by the way, I do. And that's my worst thing, is that I do think I'm right. There's my mother used to say, there's bad taste and there's my taste, and you have to be really careful about that. So you have to constantly challenge yourself and enable yourself to be challenged, I think. But you somehow have to have a principle that you're fundamentally interested in the exchange of ideas.
Okay.
Because otherwise, I don't know how you get to where you need to be.
So, and that fundamental interest allows you somehow to maintain your own sense of self while being with and exploring differences with other people, something like that.
But I don't want people to listen to this and think I'm holding myself up as a paramount.
No, I understand.
I'm not. And I can be. There are moments when I'm at my worst, when I'm absolutely, I'm intellectually and verbally quite dexterous. And I absolutely can just argue without contradiction. And it's not very pretty, really.
Yeah. It's an ongoing process for all of us, isn't it? Stumbling on like that and making mistakes and being kind enough to ourselves, I guess, as we do that too.
It's nice of you to say that. I tend, because I have a terrible combination of being egotistical and insecure, which means I always think it's my fault.
Yeah.
So I always think it's just me.
I understand. We probably need to draw it to a close, because I know you've got other very important things to do. You want to add anything, or are you happy to stop there?
Than talking to you. I mean, let me say that. And who was it who said that thing about always be sincere, whether you mean it or not?
Shall we end there? Is that okay?
I think so.
All right, lovely, Simon. Thank you ever so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm tempted also to say, could get you back in a year's time or something and see how it's all going for you. And if we're still doing it at that point, that'd be
Well, if
lovely to
you're
do that.
still doing it and I'm still alive, then let's have another go.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And just for everybody else who's listening, there are a bunch of other episodes on the website at the moment, and more will follow. But Simon, thank you very much again. Lovely to spend time with you, and see you again soon, I hope.
Yes, I hope so.
Take care.